Friends, I'm just delighted to welcome all of you with us as we enter now into a study of lesson number 6. And this is one of the most important lessons that we have as we go through the travail of the founding fathers in discovering what was necessary to put into our great Constitution. And that's really why we've called it the miracle of America. It really was a miracle. All right, now as the founding fathers rallied together, you'd be surprised. Many of them referred to it as a frightening experience that they were going into. They were actually frightened, and that's your first blank. It was a frightening experience. I think that's probably because they knew what a tragedy it would be if they failed, and they knew how difficult it would be to succeed. All right? Now here are the things that were happening. You see, as they went to Philadelphia in 1787, the whole American experiment was falling to pieces. We often don't think of that. I mean, those men met together under circumstances which didn't really offer very much promise. Now, first of all, the unity, and that's your number 1 blank, that had existed during the Revolutionary War had virtually disappeared. And the whole country was in a state of deep depression. Everywhere there was tremendous anxiety. As a matter of fact, there was a very high rate of inflation, much higher than we have today. The dollar had gone down to practically nothing, and they even had rioting breaking out. All right, that's number 2, was depression. Furthermore, the states themselves were all quarreling. They were quarreling among themselves. They were even putting out their militia on their own borders because they didn't trust one another. They were fighting over boundaries in the west and fishing rights in the east, quarreling. Furthermore, they were treating one another like foreign nations. Each state treated the other state as though they were foreign nations. And if you wanted to go from Connecticut to New York, you had to go through customs. You want to go from New York to Philadelphia down, you got to go through customs as you come into Pennsylvania. Want to go to Maryland? Customs. Want to cross over and go to Virginia? Customs. That's the way they were treating one another. All right, number 5. What was worse, you had a situation where the Spanish, you see, the Spanish were coming up along the Mississippi Valley and were beginning to take our territory and had hired General Wilkinson, a former American, you see, or had been American general, to help get the Indians all uprising, and they were beginning to take over that territory. All right, now furthermore, up along right up along here and further up along here, the British had established forts where they had their British soldiers, and they wouldn't take those troops home. That's number 6. They wouldn't remove their troops, and they didn't until 1796 because they thought we were falling apart. And they were going to come in there and pick up the pieces. The Spanish were going to get their bit, and the British were going to get theirs. That's the way they were thinking. Now there was such tremendous hostility between the various states that New England said, we're seceding. We're just going to forget about perpetual union. We're going on our own. We can do better alone. And New York and the middle states said, good riddance. And the southern states said, well, we could do better without both of you. So those were bitter days. Now that's hostility. And capital 8, it was obvious that the central government authority that had been set up, you see, before in 1776 up to 81, called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, it was obviously that they were a failure. And that's your blank. They were a failure. It wasn't working. The central government was incapable of doing the jobs that needed to be done. Now, the whole civilized world was actually watching to see what the founding fathers could do to somehow save these disunited states. I suppose if they'd been taking odds, they would have said the chances are only about 10 to 1 that they can succeed. 1 to 10, however they give odds. And so that brings us now to the fact that it really was a miracle that they even held a convention. And that's your blank there, Roman numeral 1, miracle. Let me just trace for you very briefly what the circumstances were that led up to that convention. Capital A, during the Revolutionary War, an aide to Washington, who was Alexander Hamilton, did everything he could in writing to the states and saying, you've got to do something. about strengthening the central government before it's too late. You've got to be able to either amend the articles or hold a convention or do something so that we can get greater strength and give the soldiers the support that they need. And nothing happened. That's Hamilton. All right? It did, however, result in some attempts being made to amend the Articles of Confederation. Amend. But in order to amend the Articles, you had to have every state agree. And there was always a stinker, that would hold out. No matter what they'd try to do, there would be always one or more states that would say, no dice. Nope, not going to do it. All right, finally, in 1782, Hamilton petitioned, or at least succeeded in getting the legislature of New York, and that's your blank, New York, to pass a resolution calling for a constitutional convention. And no other state would support it. Not another single state would support it. All right? Capital D. In 1783, as we come toward the close of the Revolutionary War, Hamilton was elected to Congress. And as soon as he got there, he started agitating for a constitutional convention. This is clear back in 1783. Congress ignored him. Absolutely ignored him. Well, in 1783, President Washington discovered something scandalous. The soldiers were being paid off in penny dollars. They'd been promised land after the war, over in Ohio Valley, and they thought they could get started again. Other people had stayed home, and some of them become very wealthy during the war. And they thought they'd get a little stipend to get started again. Their money was worth nothing. The land wasn't going to be given to them. And they said, this is just terrible. What have we fought for anyway? And so they began planning a coup of seizing power in the United States and setting Washington up as a king. Well, as soon as Washington heard about it, he gathered his main officers together. And this is a very famous scene in which he read a statement to them. And he said, I know how difficult it is for all of you, but we've just started our central government. And he said, I just want to tell you that we must stay together in this pattern, not the one of going to a king or a monarch or anything else. As a matter of fact, he said, the Congress is trying. Let me read you a letter from a congressman. And he tried to read it. And it was little tiny letters. He couldn't read it. So he put on his Benjamin Franklin bifocals. Benjamin Franklin, invented bifocals. And he put them on. He still couldn't read it. And you know what he did? He finally just took off his glasses and said, gentlemen, I've grown gray in your service. Now I'm growing blind. And that did it. All of a sudden they remembered him at Monmouth and Valley Forge, and they realized that if this thing didn't go, there wasn't anyone had more to lose than he did. And if he was willing to trust the Congress, they would too. And so he put it all back together, and they went home. They said, all right, we'll try, we'll endure a little further. Now immediately Washington wrote to all of the states, and that's capital F, in which he pleaded with the states to organize themselves and get a constitutional convention going. And nothing happened. Isn't that something? Nothing happened. All right, by 1785, Washington could endure it no longer. And so he was down there at Mount Vernon, that beautiful home. I'm sure some of you have been there, and I've been there many times. I love to go down there and just meditate. I walked past the tomb of Washington down there. There's a great spirit at Mount Vernon. And he said, look, we're fighting with Maryland, Virginia. What are we doing that for? Why don't you send delegates over to Maryland or vice versa and get together? Do you know those delegates hated each other so much they were going to meet in a boat out in the middle of the Potomac? Well, he said, for heaven's sakes, come over to Mount Vernon. We'll get on the back porch there and sip a little something and work it out. And that's exactly what they did. They were so successful, and it was so nice to be together and work out all those problems that they decided they would recommend that there be a trade conference for all the states so they could all work out their problems. And so that's H, trade. Well, that trade conference was held in Annapolis in September 1786. But guess what? Only 5 states sent delegates. So that wasn't a quorum, so you couldn't decide anything permanently. But they had such a marvelous time getting together and uniting their wonderful friendships from the past that they said, why don't we ask the Congress to set up a convention and settle all of our problems, not just trade. Let's have a great constitutional convention. And so it was scheduled for May the 14th, 1787, and that's your blank under I. May the 14th, 1787. Now, Roman numeral II. Authorities recognize, and it's in all of your textbooks, that the Constitutional Convention became the most important convocation of political leaders in the history of the world. In the history of the world. Now, we don't study it much anymore, and that's why we hold these seminars, so we can get better acquainted with these men who came up with this marvelous formula for freedom that was the hope of the world. All right, it was fortunate that each state had the good sense to send its most outstanding leaders, and that's your blank, the most outstanding leaders. All right, altogether there were 72 delegates appointed to attend this great convention. But many of the states were so stingy, they'd appoint a man to go down and represent them and wouldn't raise the money to even pay his expenses, let alone being down there for 4 months. Most of the founding fathers, it now turns out, that were at this convention had to borrow money to stay there, including Madison. Amazing. Almost in poverty. They had been men of wealth and circumstances, etc. Many of them had large lands. But that's what the revolution had done to them. Anyway, only 55 finally showed up, was able to attend, and that's capital B. Now, there was one state that wouldn't come at all, and that was Rhode Island. Rhode Island was so independent. It was just a tiny state, but I'll tell you, they were very independent and on their own, and the other states got to calling her Rogue Island. Rogue Island. And when the convention finally convened, about 13 businessmen got together and wrote a letter of apology that their leaders were so obstinate. All right, now, because of personal circumstances, President Washington was almost prevented from coming. And that's quite a remarkable story because he'd agitated for this for so long. But guess what had happened? His brother had just died, his mother was very ill, and his sister wasn't expected to live, and he was in terrible pain from rheumatism. He could hardly stand a sheet over him. There was a terrible amount of pain in his right shoulder and his elbow and in his wrist. But Madison and others said, General Washington, if you don't come, it'll fail. The whole country's watching to see if you're going to come. Because if you don't come, they'll know you've lost confidence in the whole idea of a central government anyway. So he strapped his right arm to his chest so he could endure the pain in his shoulder and his arm, got in his carriage and arrived the day before the convention was supposed to start. So prevented is capital, is your blank for D. Now there was another elderly man that didn't know it, but he will be dying in about a year. And he was in terrible pain too. He had been out of the United States during 25 of the last 30 years, had just returned, and he was 81 years of age. This is Benjamin Franklin, a great man, much greater than our recent writers have said he was. As a matter of fact, research at Yale University now discloses that many of the things that we've been hearing about Benjamin Franklin and immorality and his affairs are turning out to have been manufactured tales. This Benjamin Franklin has not been allowed to attain his stature of greatness that he deserves. And so Yale, I'm so happy to say, are now doing something about getting the real story of Franklin to the people. Now he was 81 at this time, and 2 or 4 prisoners would bring him in a sedan chair. First time we'd ever had one in the United States. He saw them in France, and these men would carry him in long poles and seat him there in the convention in the morning and bring him back at night. There were trustees from the local prison. They thought it was a great honor to carry the great Franklin to the convention and bring him home. All right, capital F. 2 men who made some of the greatest contributions to the convention weren't there. And they were John Adams, who was our minister over in England. And here you see his picture on the screen. And John Adams was a great man, a little short fellow, but a brilliant mind, brilliant mind. And he had written a document on a defense of the constitutional idea in America that they were trying to develop, separation of powers, checks and balances, and all the things that Polybius and Montesquieu and John Locke had talked about. And all the founders had read it. He had a great influence on the convention. The other one was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson sent hundreds of books to Madison. And he said, now here are the things that are wrong with the Articles of Confederation that must be repaired. And you know, Madison is called the father of the Constitution, but as a matter of fact, much of the greatness of Madison belonged to Thomas Jefferson. They were neighbors there in Virginia and very close in their personal relationship. And so Jefferson, who had been such a great scholar of political science, sent over this information to Madison, and Madison therefore came to the convention the best prepared person of all. He was practically a walking encyclopedia as a result of the cram session he put himself through in reading those numerous books. All right? Capital G. In terms of experience and professional training, the 55 delegates represented a cross-section of the most capable men in the country. The most capable men in the country. Now I've got some little numbers here. 2 were college presidents. 3 were or had been college professors. 4 had studied law in England. 31 were members of the legal profession, several of them being judges. 9 had been born in foreign countries and knew the oppression of Europe from firsthand experience. 28 had served in Congress, and most of the rest had served in state legislatures. I mean, these men came prepared for their job. They knew all of the intricacies of having a government of the people, the things that had to be kept in mind as you gradually gather the people's thinking into consensus so that we move together, not because we're forced or dictated to, but because we want to. That's government of the people. And then 19 or more had served in the Army. 17 had been officers, 4 on Washington's staff. Now an interesting thing happened. You know, they set up the date for the convention for May the 14th, 1787. But there weren't enough people in attendance. Only 2 delegations had arrived by then. This proved to be an advantage, and that's your blank, an advantage. The 2 delegations which had arrived by the 14th were Virginia and, of course, Pennsylvania, where the program was being put on, where the convention was being held. Virginia and Pennsylvania. Now, a capital B, when the Virginia delegation realized there was going to be a delay, they immediately began early morning caucuses. That's meetings, of course. And they all sat around and listened to James Madison, and that's your blank, describe to them what he had worked out as a result of talking or writing to Jefferson and reading all of these books. So capital C, when it finally came time for the convention to convene, and they did have enough people there, Madison and his associates had worked up a total of 15 resolutions or resolves which formed the agenda for the entire convention. In other words, everybody else came wondering what we were going to do for a constitution. And the Virginia delegation said, we've thought it through, this is what we basically recommend. All right, Roman numeral 4. The Constitutional Convention officially opened on Friday, May the 25th, 1787, with 7 states now represented. That's a quorum, so they could start business. And they were all represented very shortly by the delegations from every state except Rhode Island, as I have already mentioned. All but Rhode Island. And you'll be interested to see what Rhode Island does after the Constitution is written. Okay, capital A. The first order of business was to elect a president, and of course, unanimously it was George Washington. George Washington. And in the picture on the screen, you see him presiding at the convention. All right, now they had hired a secretary by the name of Major Jackson of South Carolina, but he wasn't really competent. His notes are very sketchy. The real details were written down by James Madison, who got a seat right up close to the speaker's table where he could hear everything and he would stay up so late at night writing up the speeches and the arguments pro and con. 2 or 3 times during the convention he became very ill. But thanks to him, we know what happened at the convention, and his notes were kept secret for 30 years, and that's your other blank. 30 years until finally they were released, and then Congress ordered them to be printed in 1843, so we would know what happened there. Now, those are the notes we've been studying for your program here. All right, a number of interesting rules were adopted by the convention as a result of a committee setting them up. First of all, the proceedings were to be secret. They're going to be secret. Now, that make you nervous? Well, the Founding Fathers had a good reason for having these secret. They said, we really don't know what we're going to do. And we don't want a lot of, while we're jangling about it and trying to come to consensus, because we know what we want, we just don't know how to get there. And we don't want a lot of publicity about how we're quarreling and this one's taking this position and then be embarrassed when he changes his mind. You see, that's not good. We'll be judged by the fruits of our labor. So we're going to do our labor in secret. And then they can judge the way they want to. So there were guards put at the door. All the windows were closed, and they just sat there and sweat during those 4 terrible months. The fellows from up in New England all had wool worsted suits. From down South Carolina, they came more sensibly in white suits. But anyway, secret is what you have there. Number 2, they decided that each state can have only 1 vote. Now that means that you've got a delegation of 5. At least 3 of them must be present and voting in unity, and that's the way that the vote will go. Sometimes only 2, or there would be 4 there, and they divide up 2 and 2, and then it would be division, and they couldn't have a vote. Or if they had 5 and only 1 showed up that particular day, there's no vote for that particular state that day. Everybody follow that? All right. And 3, they said, we want to take a poll of you individually without talking about state votes, just to see how you all feel. And then we won't record it, so that if you change your mind, you won't be embarrassed. Recorded is number 3. All right, now, each person could only speak twice on the same issue. Now, that was to keep some people from monopolizing it and giving one big oration after another. All right? Speak twice. Now, no one was allowed to read during the speeches you couldn't say, oh, that's such a boring talk, and pick up a manuscript and not listen to what he was saying. Out of courtesy, they insisted that everybody listen attentively to what was being said. No one was to pick up anything and read a manuscript or book while others were talking. And so that's your blank reading. And all remarks were to be addressed to the president. Now you may wonder why, as you read the minutes of the convention, it's always, and Mr. President, my colleague has just made a statement which I don't think is worthy of a gentleman of his caliber. I don't think it's true. In fact, it's false. You know, they get pretty heated sometimes. The idea was to always address the president so you don't have the delegates pointing the finger and saying, you know how that goes. There was to be dignity in this convention. So you always have to talk to the president. All right? And so that's your blank for 6. Now, capital D. And now the opening of the delegates, the hope of the delegates was that they could reach a general agreement rather than resort to compromise. Now that's very important to understand about the convention. There's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding concerning this. And the founders wanted to talk it out and talk it out and talk it out until they had reached a point where there was general agreement rather than compromise, which is your blank there. Now, 2 procedures were adopted to facilitate this. There was not to be any railroading through by the leadership, the Virginia delegation, for example. First of all, they said, we will adopt the technique of going into a committee of the whole body. Now, that's a fantastic thing. Committees are usually a small specialized group that does special study, isn't that right? Now, what they do, they go from a convention into a committee of the whole. And so you have Washington stepping down, and you have Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts taking over the chair. Now this means you can do anything informal. You can vote any way you want to. We can cancel out tomorrow. It keeps it very informal. Then when we've really got it shaken down, we'll move back into convention. Washington takes the chair, and then we will solemnly vote our decision. See how they did that? And then finally, to make it even better, that's WHOLE, Committee of the Whole Body. And then number 2, they decided even if they had voted on it as a convention, if anybody was not comfortable with it, they'd open it up for further debate and voting. I tell you, they just wanted to keep that flexible, and so that everybody had his fair shake and his say. All right, capital E. As it turned out, a general agreement was reached in all areas except 3. Now, very often you'll hear that the Constitution is a conglomerate of compromises. That's not what the record shows. They talked it out, till they got in a consensus on everything except 3 areas, and one was slavery. Now the question was how soon the federal government could go in and regulate or eliminate slavery. And the delegation from Virginia was the one that led out for the absolute abolition of slavery. They had just put it in the Northwest Ordinance, but there were a number of reasons why they thought it ought to be postponed temporarily, as I've mentioned earlier. And so they put it over for 20 years and said, slavery, we hope, will be phased out by then. If it is not, as some of them later said, this terrible affliction on our nation will be eliminated by action of the federal government. And 2 was, how should we have the states represented? Do you want it by the people or by individual states? That was another one. So it was by population or by the individual states. Now, whether the federal government should have authority to regulate interstate commerce was also one that was resisted by the South, but they finally compromised it. All right, now it's not a conglomerate of compromises as some have suggested. Most of it was achieved by agreement or consensus, and they just talked it out till they achieved that. Well, it was Tuesday, May the 29th, after a delegation from 9 states had arrived, that all the preliminaries had been arranged, and the Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia was able to rise and present Virginia's 15 resolutions, which became actually the agenda for the entire conference. Before the convention was over, these resolutions had grown to 23, and that's your second blank. First one is resolutions, and then 23. Now, since no country in the world had ever been set up the way the Virginia resolution suggested, every single point had to be carefully analyzed and debated. It also should be kept in mind that Congress had only told them to revise the Articles of Confederation, revise it. But Madison was correct when he said, after all, anything that we do has to go to Congress and the states, so capital B is Congress. So we're only actually an advisory body. And so when we get through, it'll go to the Congress. They're the ones that make it law, not us. And since we see the Articles of Confederation are impractical, let's go all the way. And then further than that, they realized that whatever they came up with, they had to be able to justify it before the Congress and the states who would have to ratify it. All right. Now we're ready to come to grips with some of the things they worked on, and that's where we will begin in our next session.